They said no woman would climb that mountain to keep house for a man like Sela's Rourke, not with 3 broken children and a grief that had frozen every room in the place. He didn't want warmth. He wanted someone quiet, someone plain, someone who'd cook and clean and stay out of his sorrow. What came up the pass instead was a soft, round woman with mud on her hem and kindness she didn't know how to hide, and she looked at that ruined family like she'd already decided to love them before she even knocked. This is the story of the winter she arrived. The winter a little girl who hadn't spoken in a year finally had something to say. Stay with me till the end, because what she gave those children, nobody up there believed was still possible. The baby had been crying for the better part of an hour, and there wasn't a soul in that house willing to pick her up. I stood at the bottom of the stairs with my hat in my hands, an old man who'd wrangled worse than a crying child, and I'll tell you plain, I couldn't make my boots move. Little Wren was up in the cold room they still called the nursery, hollering the way babies do when they've given up on being answered, that hoarse, resigned crying that's worse than any scream. And down the hall, behind a shut door, I could hear Sela's Rourke not moving, not going to her. A man who'd carry a fevered calf 2 miles through snow across his own shoulders, and he couldn't cross 15 feet of pine floor to lift his own daughter. I want to be fair to him. I've kept a tally book on this mountain for 31 years, every calf dropped, every fence mended, every dollar spent and lost. And if I've learned one thing from all that ciphering, it's that a man is more than the worst winter of his life. But that winter, the Rourke place was as close to a haunted house as any I've stood in, and the ghost was a woman none of us would say out loud. Her name had been Ada. She died 14 months back, bringing Wren into the world, and she took the whole family's voice down into the ground with her. I finally went up, old knees and all. I picked the baby out of the cold and she quieted against my coat, and I stood there in the dark rocking her and cursing under my breath at every grown man on that place, myself included. Through the frost on the window I could see the pass, the long white cut through the timber where the road came up, and that's when I saw the wagon. You have to understand what kind of fool comes up Coldwater Mountain in the last week of November. The sky had that low iron look to it, the kind that means snow's coming and coming heavy, and the light was going. And here was a hired rig, 1 horse, laboring up through the drifts with a body sitting on the box wrapped in so many shawls it took me a moment to make out it was a woman, a wide woman. Round in the shoulder, round in the face, holding the reins in mittened hands and leaning into that grade like it was a personal argument she meant to win. I said a word I won't write down, because I'd forgotten. Or I'd made myself forget, the way you do with a thing you don't believe will actually come. 6 weeks back, in a rare hour of what I took for sense, Sela's had let me post an advertisement in the ledger down in the valley. Widower with 3 children seeks a housekeeper. Steady work, hard country. No romance wanted or offered. He'd said that last part like a man nailing a board over a window. And a letter had come, and then another, and he'd grunted his way through some arrangement I hadn't paid full mind to, because I never once thought a living woman would say yes. She'd said yes. And she was coming up the mountain in the teeth of the first real snow of the year like she couldn't feel the cold at all. I carried Wren down, and I stood in the doorway of the front room where Sela's sat by a fire he wasn't tending, and I said, "Company." He didn't look up. 38 years old, and he'd started to sit like an old man, elbows on his knees, staring into coals. "Send them off." "It's the housekeeper," I said, "the one you sent for, and unless you mean to bury a woman in your own dooryard by morning, you'll not send her back down that road in this." That got him up. Her name was Josephine Vaughn, and she near fell off the wagon into my arms when I went out to help her down, laughing and apologizing in the same breath, her cheeks whipped red as winter apples. Oh, thank you, I'm sorry, my legs have gone to wood. I've been up on that seat since the sun. Is this the Rourke place?" "Please tell me this is the Rourke place. If it isn't, I've made a very cold mistake." She got her feet under her and stood there in the yard, a whole soft mountain of a woman in a brown traveling coat that had lost its buttons to the strain, and she took one look at the house, that dark, unlit, hard-shouldered house, and I watched something move across her face. Not fear, not the dismay I expected. Sorrow, quick and gone, like she could read the grief off the very logs. "Josephine Vaughn," she said, putting out a red mitten. "Josie, if it suits you, and you must be Mr. Rourke." "That's the hand," I said. "Wade Cormac. Mr. Rourke's inside. I hunted for the word. There isn't a kind one. He's not much for greeting." "No," she said softly, still looking at the house. "I don't expect he is." We got the horse stabled and her one trunk hauled in, and the whole while she talked, not empty talk, but the warm running kind that fills a silence so you don't have to. She'd come up from Kansas, she said. She kept house for a doctor's family 11 years and they'd moved east and had no need of her, and she'd seen the advertisement and something about it had, and here she used a word I turned over a long time after. Something about it had called to her. A widower, 3 children, hard country. Most women would have read that and run the other way. She'd read it and packed a trunk. Silas met her in the front room, and it went about how you'd fear. He stood by the cold hearth with his arms crossed like a fence post, and he looked her over, the size of her, the softness, and I saw the flicker of a man revising a plan. He'd wanted, I think, some spare gray whip of a woman he could pay and ignore. Somebody who'd move through the house like weather, changing nothing. "You understand the terms," he said, not a hello. "You keep the house. You mind the children's needs, feeding, washing, mending. You don't—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "You don't try to make anything of it. This is a wage, not a family." Josie held his eyes, and I'll never forget it because most folks couldn't hold Silas Rourke's eyes at all that year. There was too much broke behind them. But she looked back at him steady and gentle as a person looking at a hurt animal, and she said, "I understand the terms, Mr. Rourke, and I'll not intrude on your grief." It was the word grief that did it. He flinched like she'd touched an open wound. Nobody up there had said it out loud in 14 months. We'd all been walking around the hole in the floor pretending it was floor. "Wade'll show you the kitchen," he said, and left the room. Josie let out a breath, set her shoulders, and turned to me with a smile that was 3 parts warmth and 1 part iron and said, "Well, Mr. Cormac, where are the children?" The children were the thing, of course. A man's grief is his own business, but children can't afford to wait for a man to come back from wherever the dead have taken him. There were 3. I'd best set them down here the way I'd have written them in my book, since I've a fondness for accounts. Eli, 11 years old and going on ancient. He'd been his mother's boy, and when she died he'd shut like a trap. Angry all the time and about everything, and underneath the anger a terror I recognized because I'd worn it myself as a boy, the terror of a child who's decided that loving anybody is just signing up to lose them. He worked. That was his way. 11 years old, and he did a man's chores from dark to dark, wouldn't be thanked, wouldn't be helped. Wren, the baby, 14 months, who'd never known her mother at all and had been passed hand to hand among grieving people who couldn't stand to look at her too long, because her being born was the same day of Ada dying, and nobody had ever untangled the two. That's a hard thing to carry before you can even walk. And Nell, 7 years old, and Nell hadn't spoken a word in more than a year. She could. There was nothing wrong with her that a doctor could name. She'd been a chattering, singing little thing, they told me. I came onto the place after, so I only knew the quiet one. But the day her mother died, something in Nell had closed its mouth and not opened it since. She'd point. She'd nod. She'd cry without a sound, which is the most terrible crying there is. And she carried, everywhere she went, a small gray felt rabbit her mother had sewn her, so worn it had lost its eyes, and she'd not let a living soul touch it. That first evening Josie found them the way you'd find deer in timber, slow, without sudden movement. Eli in the barn, refusing supper. Wren in my arms still, because I hadn't dared set her down. And Nell in the corner of the kitchen, folded into the smallest shape a child can make, watching this enormous stranger move around her mother's stove with big, frightened eyes. Josie didn't rush her. I'll give her that from the very first. Any fool with a good heart wants to swoop straight in and fix a hurt child, and it's the exact wrong thing a hurt child reads swooping as danger. Josie just cooked. She'd found the flour and the last of the fall apples, and she made a thing my grandmother used to make, apple dumplings, and the whole cold kitchen filled up with cinnamon and warm dough. And she talked low to herself the way a body does when they want a scared creature to get used to the sound of them. And she set a bowl down on the floor, not at the table, on the floor near Nell's corner like you'd set milk for a barn cat, and she didn't watch to see if it got taken. She just went back to her work. I watched from the doorway, holding the baby, and I saw that little girl's hand, that thin, chapped little hand still clutching her eyeless rabbit, creep out and pull the bowl into the dark of her corner. And I heard, for the first time in that house in 14 months, the small sound of a child eating something sweet. Josie never turned around, but I saw her wipe her face with the back of her wrist, quick, and go on stirring. The snow came that night like the sky meant to bury us, and it kept us all under one roof, which is how the first crack came. Around midnight Wren started up again. She was a poor sleeper, that baby, and no wonder, and I heard the floor creak and figured it was me being called on again, my usual post. But by the time I'd got my bad knee working and made the haul, the crying had already stopped. Josie was in the nursery. She'd lit no lamp. She was just sitting in the old rocker in her nightclothes with a shawl thrown over, and she had Wren against that soft, ample shoulder, one big warm hand spread across the baby's whole back, and she was rocking, slow, humming something with no tune I knew. And Wren, who fought sleep like it was a wolf, had gone loose and heavy against her, out cold, one fist knotted in the shawl. I've thought about it a great deal since, why that baby settled so fast for a stranger. I think it was simple as this. Josie was soft. There was a great deal of her, and it was all warm, and a baby that had spent 14 months being held by careful, brittle, grieving arms had finally landed somewhere that felt like being held ought to feel, like a body that wasn't afraid of her. I turned to go, and I about walked into Sela's. He was standing in the dark hall in his shirt, and he'd seen the whole thing over my shoulder, and his face, Lord, his face. He was looking at that woman rocking his youngest child, and he had the expression of a man watching a door he'd nailed shut swing slowly open, wanting and dreading it in the same instant. He didn't say anything. He went back down the hall. But in the morning I found him already up before the girls, and he'd brought in an armload of good dry pine, and laid a fire in the kitchen stove so it'd be warm before Josie came down to it. He'd never once done such a thing for himself. He'd have died before he called it what it was, but that was the first thing. That was the crack in the ice. He didn't send her away. He wanted to, I could see him wanting to for days, because a man that's scared of feeling anything will run from warmth the way most men run from fire. But the snow held her there, and then the children held her there, and by the time the pass cleared enough to send her down again, if he'd a mind to, something had happened that couldn't be undone. Nell had followed her out to the henhouse. Just followed, 10 steps behind, clutching her rabbit, quiet as ever, but she followed. And Josie, bless her, didn't make one word of it. She just left the henhouse door open a little wider than she needed to, so a small, silent girl could see in. By the middle of December, I'd started keeping 2 columns in my tally book that had no business being there. One I marked feed and stock, same as 30 years running. The other I never gave a heading to because I'd have been embarrassed to, but if I'm honest, it was an account of a thaw. Nell took supper at the table, foot of it. Eli let Jay mend his coat. S spoke at breakfast, 4 words, little entries. The kind of small victories a man doesn't notice are victories until he sees them written in his own hand and the total surprises him. Because Josie Vaughn was working a change up on that mountain, and she was doing it the way water works stone, without seeming to work at all. She never announced a thing. She never sat any of us down and declared her intentions toward our broken hearts. She just cooked and mended, and kept the house so warm and full of good smells that the cold seemed to lose some of its grip on the place. And slowly, one soul at a time, that family crept toward her like plants toward a window. Wren was easiest, being too young to know she was supposed to grieve. Within a fortnight that baby wouldn't settle for anybody else, and she'd taken to riding on Josie's hip through the whole day's work, a fat happy little sentry watching the house get scrubbed. She'd learned Josie's name before any other word. Not Mama Josie was careful, always careful, never to let that door swing where it oughtn't. But Jojo, the baby, said, patting that soft cheek with a starfish hand, "Jojo." And I saw Josie hold very still the first time, like a woman receiving something she wasn't sure she had a right to. Nell was slower and dearer for it. The girl had gone from the corner to the foot of the table, and from the foot of the table to Josie's side at the stove, standing on a stool to watch dough get rolled, her eyeless rabbit tucked in her apron pocket now instead of clutched to her chest. Still no words, but she'd started humming. I heard it first while she was drying spoons, a thin, tuneless little thread of sound, and it stopped the second she caught me listening. But it had been there, a closed throat testing whether it still worked. Josie never once said, "Talk to me, child." Never coaxed, never bribed, never made the girl's silence into a thing that needed curring in front of her. She just talked to Nell like the answers were coming, left gaps where a reply would go, and filled them herself with an easy, "Oh, you think so too? I thought you might," so that Nell got to have a conversation without the terror of being made to speak in it. That's a wisdom you don't learn from a book. I asked her about it once while Nell was out of the room, where she'd come by such patience with a hurt child. And that's the night I learned what Josie Vaughn was carrying up that mountain, under all those shawls. She was rolling out pie dough, and she didn't look up from it, and she said it plain, the way people say the hardest things flat, so the words won't tip over. "I had a girl," she said, "once, little Ruth. She'd have been near Nell's age now." The rolling pin went back and forth. Flour rose and settled. Scarlet fever took her, and her father the same winter. Different, that was his lungs, but the same winter, so it comes to the same in my accounting. I was 31 and I had a full house one Michaelmas and an empty one by spring. She turned the dough, dusted it, went on. "And I'll tell you what nobody told me, Mr. Cormack, that I'd have given my 2 hands to have somebody tell me then. The grief doesn't leave. Folks say it does, that time heals. That's a lie people tell so you'll stop making them uncomfortable. It doesn't leave." She looked up at me at last, and her eyes were wet but her voice was iron steady. "It just makes room. If you let it. It sits down beside you, and after a long while it stops taking up the whole bed, and there gets to be room again. For other things. For other people." She looked toward the doorway where, unbeknownst to either of us, a very small girl was standing very still in the dark hall, listening. "That's all I mean to do here," Josie said quietly. "Just show them there gets to be room." I didn't have a word to say to that. I'm a ledger man. I count things. I've no arithmetic for that kind of sum. So I did what I do, and I went out to the barn on my bad knee, and I stood with the horses in the dark for a while, and I found my own face was wet, thinking of a woman who'd lost her only child crossing 300 miles of hard country to go and love somebody else's. And in the hall Nell had heard every word. "It just makes room." I didn't know she'd heard it then. I only understood it later by what she did with it. Eli was the hard nut, and the way he cracked near broke my heart. He'd built himself into a little iron man, that boy. He'd taken up his mother's death as a job and gone to work grieving it the only way an 11-year-old knows, by refusing to need one single thing from anybody ever again. He wouldn't be softened. When Josie set his plate down heaped, he'd eat it in furious silence and be gone to the barn before she could ask after his day. When she called him honey once, offhand, the way she called everybody, he'd wheeled on her white with rage. Don't you call me that. You're paid, you're just paid." And he'd flung out into the snow, and I heard him splitting wood out there for 2 hours in the dark, driving the axe like he meant to kill the winter itself. Silas should have gone to him, but Silas couldn't go to himself in those days, let alone his angry son. So it was Josie who went out into the cold, and she didn't bring a lantern of soft words. She knew better. She just picked up the second axe and started splitting the other end of the pile. Didn't say a thing. Just worked alongside him, this big soft woman swinging an axe in the snow, and let him be furious in company for once instead of alone. He lasted maybe 20 minutes. Then the axe came down and stayed down, and I heard, through the barn wall where I was pretending to check a girth, the sound of that iron boy finally coming apart, great ugly heaving sobs, a whole year and more of them. The kind of body can only cry when they've decided at last they're safe enough to. And Josie didn't say they're there. She didn't say it's all right, because it wasn't, and she'd never lie to a child. She just set down her axe and gathered that stiff, furious, weeping boy into all that warmth and held on while he fought it and then stopped fighting it. And over the top of his head, into the falling snow, I heard her say only, I know, honey, I've got you, I know." He let her call him honey after that. I put it in my nameless column that night and had to stop and take my spectacles off and clean them, though there wasn't a thing wrong with them. Now, I've made it sound like a straight climb, and grief is never a straight climb. It's a mountain trail, you go up and you go up, and then the trail drops you clean off a ledge you never saw coming. The ledge, for us, came the week before Christmas. It started fine, better than fine. Josie had it in her head to make the children a Christmas, the first real one in 2 years, and she got the whole place stirred up with it. Eli sent to cut a spruce, Nell rolling gingerbread with flour to her elbows, popcorn strung, the works. And Silas, this is the part that mattered. Silas had come in from the range one evening and stood in the kitchen doorway watching his 3 children laughing in the lamplight. That big warm woman in the middle of them dusted white with flour, and I watched a look cross his face that I'd have paid money to see. Longing. Naked, terrified longing. A drowning man seeing the shore. And then I watched him decide, right there in the doorway, that he wasn't allowed to swim to it. Because loving that shore meant risking losing it. And Silas Rourke had lost the one great love of his life, and it had very nearly killed him. And now here was a warmth so like coming home that his whole body was leaning toward it. And the leaning is exactly what scared the life out of him. He'd built his walls to keep from ever hurting like that again. And Josie Vaughn had walked in and taken the walls apart brick by gentle brick without so much as asking. And standing in that doorway, he felt how exposed he'd let himself get, and he panicked. I've seen the same thing in a horse that's been beat. You gentle it for weeks, and just when it's near to trusting your hand, that's when it bolts. Not before. The trust is the very thing it can't abide. He bolted the next morning. He did it cold, which was worse than doing it hot. If he'd shouted, it might have meant less. He came into the kitchen where Josie had his breakfast waiting, and he didn't sit down. He stood there with his hat already in his hand, and he said, "This has gone further than the terms." Josie went still at the stove. "The children," he said, and his voice was flat as slate, "are getting the wrong idea of what you are to this house. You're getting the wrong idea. I was clear at the start. A wage. Not a," he couldn't even say the word family this time. "I think it's best you make arrangements to go down when the pass clears after the new year. I'll pay you through the season regardless. That's fair." The kitchen was so quiet I could hear the fire tick. And here's the thing about Josie Vaughn that I hadn't fully took the measure of until that morning. I'd had her marked as soft, all that warmth, all that gentleness, the way she went slow with hurt things. I'd forgot that a woman who'll cross 300 miles of winter to love strangers is not, in any true sense, a soft woman. She's the hardest kind there is. The kind whose strength is aimed at loving, which is a great deal harder than the strength it takes to stop. She turned around from the stove. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She looked at Sela's work, this man who just cut the ground out from under her and 3 children in 11 flat words, and she said, quiet, "I'll go if you tell me to, Mr. Rourke. I've no claim here and I won't pretend to one. But you'll not tell me it's for the children. You'll tell me the truth or you'll not send me off at all." She set down the dish towel. "You're not frightened they'll be hurt. You're frightened you will. You've had a taste this week of what it's like to have a full house again, and it's woke up everything you buried with your wife, and you'd rather send the whole thing down the mountain than feel it. I understand that better than any living soul could. I've stood exactly where you're standing." Her voice caught just once and steadied. "But those children upstairs don't get a vote in your fear, and they've already lost one mother. So you be very, very sure before you make them watch somebody they've come to love pack a trunk. Because that they will not forget. And then, and this is the part I'll carry to my grave," she picked her apron back up, tied it on, and turned back to the stove. "Your eggs are getting cold," she said. "Sit down or don't." He didn't sit down. He walked out into the snow. But he didn't tell her to go, either. He just left it hanging. Left it unsaid and unresolved, which is the coward's mercy, and for the next 3 days that house was a place with a held breath in it. The children knew. Of course they knew. Children always know when the grown-ups have gone wrong. They read it off the air. Eli went silent and iron again, watching his father with a betrayed fury that near matched his old grief. Wren, sensitive as babies are to a house's weather, turned fretful and clingy. And Nell stopped humming. That thin thread of sound she'd been testing for a fortnight, that little proof that a closed throat could open, it went quiet. She pulled back to the edges of rooms. She got her rabbit up out of her apron pocket and clutched to her chest again, both eyeless and worn, and I understood with a sick drop in my stomach that we were unwinding. That everything Josie had coaxed forward was sliding back down the mountain because the child could feel the person who'd made her feel safe getting ready to be taken away. And her small body was doing the only thing it knew, closing the mouth, gripping the rabbit, going small. I did a thing then I'd never done in 31 years. I spoke to Silas about something that wasn't cattle. I found him in the barn on the 3rd night and I stood there turning my hat and I said, "You want to know what your fear's costing, go look at your daughter. She's back in the corner, and I don't mean Nell." I let that land. "I mean all 3 of them. You're about to teach those children that love is a thing that leaves. Same lesson their mothers dying taught them, except this time you're the one doing the teaching and on purpose." He looked at me like I'd struck him. "I've counted a great many things on this place, Silas," I said. "Calves and dollars and years. I never once had the arithmetic on this. But even a fool ledgerman can see when a house is being handed something it don't deserve and is about to throw it off a cliff out of pure fright." I put my hat on. "Ada's gone. I grieved her too. She was good to me. But you're not honoring her by making her 3 children as cold and shut up as you've let yourself get. That's not grief. That's just cowardice wearing grief's coat." I'd never spoke to him like that. I figured I might be looking for new work by morning. He didn't say a word. He turned back to the horse he was brushing and brushed it long after it was clean. But that was the night the mountain took the decision out of all our hands. Because that was the night the fever came for Wren. She'd been fretful for days and we'd laid it to the trouble in the house, but along about midnight she woke screaming a different scream, not the settle me scream, the hurt scream, and Josie had her up and knew inside a minute it was bad. The baby was burning, cheeks scarlet, breath coming quick and rattling, eyes gone glassy and far away. A chest fever, the kind that had carried off more children on that mountain than I could set down in my book, the kind that killed fast in the very young. And outside, the sky had opened up into the worst blizzard of the winter, wind screaming down off the peak, snow driving flat, the pass filling in even as we stood there. No fetching a doctor, no taking her down. The valley was 3 hours in fair weather and it might as well have been the moon. I watched Silas Rourke stand in that lamplit room and look at his youngest child burning up in Josie's arms. The child born the night his wife died. The child he'd never once been able to look at square because looking at her meant looking at the worst hour of his life. And I watched the whole thing come down on him at once. Josie was already moving. Cool water, willow bark. The window cracked to the killing cold because the fever needed the air. She knew what to do. God love her. She'd nursed her own girl through fevers before the last one took her, and there's a terrible knowledge in that. She was calm the way only the once broken can be calm in the middle of the exact disaster that broke them. "I need you," she said to Silas, not gentle now. Hard fast, a general's voice. "Not down the hall, not out in the barn. Here, hold your daughter while I get the water. Right now, Mr. Rourke, right now." And Silas Rourke, who had not been able to cross 15 feet of floor to lift that baby the night I first saw the wagon on the pass. Silas Rourke crossed the room and took his burning, dying child into his arms. I heard the sound he made when he did it. I won't try to spell it. It was the sound of something that had been held shut for 14 months breaking all the way open, and it had a name in it. Not Wren's name. He held his daughter against his chest, this man, and he pressed his face down into her fevered little head, and I heard him say her mother's name into her hair like a prayer and an apology at once. Ada, Ada, Ada. And then, lo, wrecked to the baby herself, the first tender word I'd ever heard him give her. "Stay, please, baby, please, you stay." The wind screamed, the fever climbed. And I stood in the doorway of that lamplit room with the storm at my back, and I did not know, watching those two frightened, broken people bend together over a child that might not see morning, whether I was witnessing a family being saved or one about to be taken apart for good. Josie came back with the water. Their hands met over the baby. Neither of them let go. And outside, the mountain kept on trying to bury us all. There's a stretch of hours in the deep of a bad night that don't belong to the clock. I've lived through a few of them, a mare down foaling, a fire in the far barn, the night we lost Ada. And that fever night of Wren's was one, a night that stretched out long past any 3 columns I could have kept, because for a while their time just quit, and there was only the small furnace of that baby's body, and the 2 people bent over it, willing her to stay in the world. I kept the fire fed. That was my post. The one useful thing an old man with a bad knee can do in a sick room is keep the wood coming and the water hot and get out of the way of the ones who know what they're about. And I kept the other 2 children away from the door, which was its own hard labor, because Eli would not be kept. He'd woke at the first scream, the way he woke at everything, already braced for the next loss. And he stood in the hall in his nightshirt, 11 years old and white to the lips, and I got in front of the door and he looked up at me with his mother's own eyes and said, low and terrible, "Is she gonna die too?" Not a question, hardly. A boy asking the mountain to please, this once, not do the thing the mountain does. And I couldn't lie to him. Josie taught me that much just by watching her. You don't lie to a grieving child, they can smell it and it costs you everything. So I got down on my bad knee to be level with him, which hurt like the devil, and I said, "I don't know, son, I truly don't, but I'll tell you what I do know. There's a woman in that room who's already buried her own little girl to a fever, and she is in there right now fighting your sisters with every last thing she's got and every hard thing she learned losing her own. And there's your father in there with her." I held his eye. "For once in 14 months, Eli, your father's in the room. You understand me. He's not down the hall, he's in the room." Something moved in the boy's face. He knew what that cost his father. He knew it better than I did. "Then I'm in the room too," he said, and he went around me, and I let him because I'd have wanted the same at his age. And there are worse things than a family being afraid together instead of apart. I won't dress up the medicine of it because I don't rightly have it. Josie worked. That's all I can tell you truthful. She cooled that baby and she warmed her by turns. She got willowbark tea down her a spoonful at a time between the coughing fits. She cracked the window to the killing air when the fever spiked and shut it when the shivering came. And she read that baby's breathing the whole night like it was scripture. catching every change before it fully came. And she talked. The whole night through, low and steady, that warm running talk she'd filled every silence in the house with since the day she came, except now it wasn't filling a silence. It was holding a rope. She talked to that baby like Wren could hear every word and had only to follow her voice back to shore. You stay with me now. Jojo's got you, that's it. You cough that up, good girl, good girl. You've got a whole Christmas coming, you hear. You've not even seen it. You've got a brother out there strung you popcorn and a sister rolled you gingerbread, and you have not seen your Christmas yet, so you'll not be going anywhere before you have. That's the arrangement. You hear me? That's the arrangement. And Silas held her, all night, never once put her down. This man who couldn't look at his youngest square for over a year held her against his heart through every hour of it, and somewhere in the deepest part of the dark, the part where time had quit, I heard him start to talk too. To Ada, to his dead wife, right out loud low like she was in the room, and maybe to him she was. I'm sorry, I heard him say. God, Ada, I'm so sorry, I couldn't look at her. She's got your hands, did you know that? She's got your very hands, and I couldn't. Every time I looked at her I saw the day I lost you, and I blamed her for it. Ada, a baby. I blamed a baby. And I let a stranger love her because I couldn't. And Josie, without breaking her rhythm with the water, without looking up, said gentle into the middle of his confession, she'd forgive you. A woman who made 3 children like these would forgive you anything, but you'll have to do the rest of the forgiving yourself. Now hold her steady, the shaking's easing. The shaking was easing. Somewhere in the blackest, coldest hour, the hour before the light, the one that's carried off more of the sick than any other, the fever broke. I felt it before I understood it. The room changed. That awful dry heat coming off the baby turned all at once to a drench of sweat, and Wren gave a great shuddering sigh and went from that rigid burning stillness to something loose and damp and deeply, ordinarily asleep. A baby sleeping. Just a baby, sleeping, her breath come easy and even. One starfish hand knotted in her father's shirt. Josie laid the back of her fingers to that small forehead and closed her eyes, and I watched her whole great soft body sag with a relief so total it was near to grief itself. There, she whispered, there, she's turned, she's through it. And Silas Rourke put his face down against his sleeping daughter's damp hair and wept, not the held shut, ashamed grief of a proud man. The other kind. The kind that's mostly gratitude, that shakes a body like a chill. The kind you cry when the mountain has decided this once to give something back instead of take it. Eli was crying. I was crying. I don't mind setting it down. The window was going gray with the first of a clear dawn. The storm had blown itself out sometime in the night while we weren't watching, spent, and the world beyond the glass was white and still and new. And that's when I heard it. Nell had come in. Nobody'd seen her get up. She'd have crept from her bed when the house woke, and she'd been standing in the doorway through God knows how much of it. The whole night. Maybe a small silent girl in a nightgown with her eyeless rabbit hung forgotten from one hand, watching the grown-ups fight for her baby sister. And now she crossed the room, past me, past Eli, past her weeping father, straight to Josie, who was easing back into the rocker, wrung out to nothing. And Nell climbed up into that soft, warm lap the way she'd not let herself do in all those weeks of creeping close. Climbed right up into all that warmth and pressed her face against Josie's neck. And in a voice like a hinge that hadn't turned in a year and more, cracked and rusty and small, so quiet we all went still as stone to be sure we'd heard it. Nell spoke. "Don't go," she said. That was all. 2 words. The first 2 words out of that child in 14 months, and they weren't Mama, and they weren't her own dead mother's name, and they weren't any grand thing. 2 plain words, aimed like an arrow at the one fear that had shut her mouth in the first place. Don't go. I have kept a tally book on this mountain for 31 years. I have set down every calf and every dollar and every death, in my own cramped hand, believing all that while that if a man only counts a thing careful enough he can hold on to it. And I will tell you that I would trade every entry I ever made, every figure in every column, for the sound of that little girl's voice coming back into the world in that gray dawn with those 2 words in it. The room came apart. Josie made a sound I'd never heard a person make, half a sob and half a laugh and all of it disbelief, and she wrapped that child up in her arms and rocked her and couldn't get a word out, she who always had a word, and she just held Nell and shook. Eli was across the room in 3 steps and burrowed in against them, done being iron, just a boy who wanted to be held too. And the baby slept on through all of it safe, her fever gone. And Silas looked at his daughter, his silent daughter speaking, her first words in over a year, and they were a plea to the woman he'd told to pack a trunk, and I watched the last wall in the man come down. Not crack. Come down all at once, the whole cold fortress of it, 14 months of it, gone in the space of 2 small words from a child he'd near let his own fear rob of everything. He knelt down by the rocker. He put one arm around his son and one around his daughter and passed them. His hand found Josie's, over the sleeping baby, the way it had over the water hours before. And he didn't make a speech. He wasn't a speech kind of man, and it wouldn't have been true if he had. He just looked at her, this woman who'd crossed 300 miles of winter to love strangers, who'd walked into a haunted house and taken it apart with her bare warm hands, who'd fought his baby's fever with the knowledge she'd bought burying her own. "Stay," he said, just the one word. The same word he'd said to the baby in the dark. "I was wrong. I was Josie. Stay." And Josie Vaughn, with one child speaking in her lap and another crying against her side, and a baby breathing easy in the arms of a man learning too late, and just in time how to be a father again, looked at him over the whole warm heap of that family, and I saw her decide to give the honest answer instead of the easy one, because she'd never once in that house given anybody less than the truth. "I never came up this mountain for a wage, Silas Rourke," she said, and her voice broke clean in half saying it. "I came up because that advertisement of yours sounded like the only house in the world as lonesome as I was. I'd already decided to stay before I ever knocked. I've not much more to set down. That was better than 2 years ago now, and I'm older and my knees worse, and I've took to letting the young hand do the fence lines while I keep the books and mind the little ones, which suits me fine. The place isn't haunted anymore. I don't know the exact day the ghost left it. Grief doesn't keep a tidy ledger the way I'd like it to. It just made room, the way Josie always said it would. Ada's got her place in that house still, her pictures on the mantel, and the children speak of her easy now, which is the whole point, that you get to keep them by speaking of them and lose them all over again by staying silent. Nell talks, Lord does she talk. Makes up for the whole silent year some days, chattering the paint off the walls, and there is not one soul on that mountain who will ever tell her to hush, myself least of all. She kept the rabbit. Josie sewed it 2 new eyes. Nell said she liked it better blind and picked them off again, and Josie laughed till she cried and let her. Silas married her in the spring down in the valley church, with all 3 children stood up front and Wren hollering through the vows the way she hollers through everything. He's not a soft man even now. You don't unlearn a hardness like his all the way, and I wouldn't trust it if he had. But he's a present one. He's in the room. He carried a crying baby 15 feet across a pine floor 1,000 times over since, and never once let on it was ever hard. And Josie kept house up on Coldwater Mountain, same as the advertisement asked. Kept it warm and full of good smells and warmer than any house I've stood in before or since. She never did get the thing she lost back. You don't. That's not how the arithmetic works, and she'd be the first to tell you so, plain over a pie crust. But she made room. And into the room she made, a whole broken family walked in out of the cold and sat down and stayed. I put it in my book the night of the wedding, last entry in the nameless column, and then I gave the column a heading at last because it had earned one. I wrote it careful in my cramped old hand. I won't tell you what I wrote. Some the man keeps.